Welcome everybody for attending our Business Support Network meeting, and our focus really is on kind of fire and flood protection for your business, employers, employees, and we've invited Trevor from BrokerLink to kind of share his expertise and information around his experiences over the past year, even with clients, and what he's seen as ways that businesses can prepare or recover from catastrophic events. So thanks again for attending today. I'm Christy Tutz. Most of you probably know me. I'm with Alberta Jobs, Economy and Trade, and one of the coordinators for the Fox Creek Business Support Network. And really the whole purpose around the Business Support Network regionally, we host these sessions and meetings across the region. The whole purpose is to come together as kind of a business group, employers, and identify common workforce challenges with the goal to derive solutions, working together and bring in resources and supports and information. So, to be able to support employers in the area. So again, thank you all for attending. And now I'd like to hand it over to Trevor with BrokerLink to share his presentation on fire and flood protection. So thank you for attending today, Trevor.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Christy. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, okay.
Yep.
So yeah, today, I'm sure you guys have had lots of, I guess, presenters or people that have talked to you, whether it's from the government, fire department, counties, municipalities, just in regards to the fires last year, how to prepare for them, things like that. My perspective is going to be a little bit from an insurance perspective. That's the industry that I'm in. I'm going to be talking to you guys about business interruption insurance. It's kind of how that relates to the catastrophic losses we've seen throughout Alberta, fire, flooding being the two major ones, and then how you can use that to protect your business, the different types of forms, things like that you're going to see in the marketplace. I've been in insurance for quite a while. A little bit about me. Spent 7 years as a director with the Insurance Brokers Association of Alberta. So we got to participate in drafting, or at least trying to participate in drafting some of the new legislation that came out with the auto reform, and they're continuing to work with government to find solutions for auto reform, but specialize in commercial insurance, based out of our Grand Prairie office right now, but spent quite a bit of time down in Whitecourt, lived down there for a couple of years, and really liked the community down there. We wrote a lot of business in the Fox Creek area, so familiar with the town, familiar with the area and what you guys have going on there for industry. Last year was a pretty big scare for everybody with the fires coming so close to the town. And I think a lot of our clients were prepared, but they didn't even know that they were prepared when it came from an insurance perspective, because they never really dove into learning anything about business interruption or how it works. And what I found when I talked to clients on the phone, and they were phoning me during, when the fires were getting close to the town, is that they weren't aware how the business interruption insurance works. So I'm going to try and kind of explain that a little bit today. And I guess we'll get started and go from there. So there we go. So what is business income interruption? Just to kind of get everybody on the same page, business income interruption replaces a lost or interrupted source of income. Insurers treat the income as a property coverage. This is something that most people don't kind of grasp when they first start talking about business income interruption coverage. And it's similar to a building coverage or building contents. And it's important to remember, just even if you're not profitable, if you're a non-for-profit organization or you're a business that's maybe operating at a loss, you still need the business income interruption coverage. It's at the end of the day, if there's a loss, there's still going to be expenses coming into the business that you're going to want to be able to cover going forward. So, but the big thing here is it is if that's moving forward, it's a property coverage. So Just a quick question here. Maybe you guys can throw it up in the chat. What type or percentage of businesses do you guys feel don't reopen after they run into a disaster? Any idea? Have you guys ever thought about that? I have a few questions on the slides, but they're really just to kind of spur some questions. So
Can I throw out a number?
absolutely, Christy.
20 to 30%?
Right in the right ballpark. So I see 60% there. So when I was looking at the statistics, two things really jumped out at me. The first one is 1 in 4 businesses do not reopen after a disaster strikes. So the answer to the question is 25%. But the second stat that jumped out at me, and this is just absolutely crushing, is 80% of small businesses that are unable to reopen within the first month following the disaster, catastrophic loss, do not reopen. So super important to be able to get through that initial phase when, you know, there's a lot of chaos going on and you're not really sure how you're going to pay expenses, you know, when the disaster is going to be over, when you're going to start the recovery phase, when you're going to reopen. Getting through that first month, super, super important if you want to stay in business. So both these examples, the terms disaster and catastrophic is used, but keep in mind suffering from a business interruption loss that is partial. This is an event that, you know, the coverage is going to help you get back up and running. Your reputation and your customers are important to the business. So the faster you get back up and running, the better you are. If I move this slide over one more. Sorry, the slide seems to be stuck here. Give me a second. There we go. Okay, so understanding what leads to a business income interruption. So we mentioned before that it was a property coverage, something that most people have a hard time wrapping their head around. Taking a closer look and understanding how it actually works is important. So when thinking what could lead to a business income interruption loss from an insurance standpoint, there are many things that we want to be talking about from a property perspective. So the loss could be caused by a fire, catastrophe, storms, floods, earthquakes. They'd be caused by damage to machinery or maybe damage caused by a power outage or power interruption. The key point really is that the property loss has to be caused by an insured peril on the policy in order for the business interruption coverage to respond. This is why so many times business interruption coverage, they'll refer to it in our industry as a follow form. Generalizing here, but the coverage is a loss under the property section, then typically the business business interruption coverage is going to follow that. So how it works is if there's a fire and you're insured for fire, then your business income interruption responds. In a lot of cases, clients sometimes, especially small businesses, will want to take coverages off that, you know, they don't really see themselves using. A good example, maybe they lease a bay in a commercial industrial building. You know, it's got a small office space up front, a mezzanine and a shop space in the back. And you know, maybe the bay is worth for them $20,000 or $25,000. Their flood deductible on their policy might be $25,000. So, and that wouldn't be a non-typical deductible on a flood policy, on a commercial policy. So why pay $300 for flood coverage? Well, if you take that flood coverage off of your policy, it's no longer an insured peril on the policy. So if there is a flood and your business income interruption is $200,000 worth of business expense, it doesn't respond because the resulting damage happened because of the flood. So keeping those small coverages on, it might seem like a premium that you don't want to pay, but making sure that you have them on there to cover for the perils that you think could cause a loss. There's resulting coverages that you're going to eliminate if you do take those off of the policy. So, okay, so loss of income resulting from the direct physical loss and a scheduled location. So this slide brings home the previous point. Business income loss has to result from a direct physical loss at a scheduled location. So two terms here. In italics, covered physical loss means a loss or damage to the insured property by an insured peril. These conditions must be present for business income interruption loss. There has to be 1, a proven loss of income, 2, a direct physical loss or damage to the insured property, and 3, it has to be caused by an insured peril under the policy. And we kind of talked about that stuff earlier. So let's say you're a restaurant owner, the weather's been terrible, your profits are down because you haven't been able to fill the patio. This wouldn't be covered. There's no loss. It's just a risk of doing business. There's no physical damage to the hotel or the restaurant property. Oh, sorry there. However, if you experienced a fire in the property and you couldn't open the patio, this would be a loss from an insured peril, the fire, and the business income interruption would respond. And you need to provide the loss of income, but there'd be clear physical damage to the insured property, and that resulting loss of income is something that would end up resulting in a claim and something that the insurance company would settle for you. The scheduled location just means the scheduled location on a property policy. You may have 2 or 3 restaurants, so those would be 2 or 3 separate scheduled locations. Something that we came into, we ran into it quite a bit with trucking companies. So they maybe had trucks that were operating out of areas, Edson, Fox Creek, happened to be 2 of them. They leased a space there, but their main shop maybe wasn't in Fox Creek. Maybe it was in Grand Prairie or Whitecourt. Now, their truck wasn't maybe able to operate, and it was down because projects were shut down and things like that. That's not always covered by business income interruption because there's no direct physical loss. And that was something that, trucking companies, there's a fire, so their trucks aren't working. And now they want to be covered for the loss of income because their trucks aren't working. There's actually no physical loss, but there is other ways where sometimes that coverage could be covered, and we'll get into that later on. But you really want to think of business income interruption as a physical loss to a property, and that result to property damage resulting in a claim. So how does it work? Essentially, businesses have income from sales, which covers expenses. These expenses are going to be things like payroll, lease payments, delivery charges, utilities, cleaning supplies, landscaping, etc. And those are the expenses that end up getting picked up by the business income interruption coverage. And when a loss happens, say a fire, the business has a source of income, usually reduced, and sometimes it's actually eliminated. So on one hand, you have an adequate property insurance. It's going to replace lost or damaged property, which includes items like the building and the contents. But in the meantime, where's the source of revenue to pay the bills that continue? Without a replacement source of income, business may have no money to pay these expenses until it reopens again. That's why the business income interruption coverage is so important. It's actually pretty affordable. It's easy to place on most policies depending on your operations, but for most cases it is. The charges that continue after the loss are typically referred to as standing charges, so we'll get into these a little bit, but they're fixed or semi-variable costs that carry on in the event of a loss. Example from the previous slide, things like rent, taxes is a big one. You're going to probably still have county property taxes or municipal property taxes to pay. Insurance is a big one. Electricity, sometimes interest on borrowed funds can be a big one, especially if you're, say, leasing spaces or you have a mortgage on a property. Doesn't cover the actual capital purchase that you're making, but it will go towards covering the interest, and the list goes on and on. So the opposite of the standing charges would be the non-standing charges. So let's say you have a production business or a manufacturing business of some kind, and the production ceases, the merchandise and packaging of that merchandise isn't going to be needed anymore. So they wouldn't cover the packaging costs because you're not producing any merchandise. Okay. So I'll just try to take a quick question here. And this is kind of a question I put in here because I want to get into the idea of contracts. But which of the following is not a standing charge? Yes, I can send a copy once it's done, you guys. Not a problem at all. I'll definitely send a copy. So, but which of these would be not a standing charge? So your lease payments, those are going to be something that continue on. Your utilities and lease payments are interesting because they're an expense, right? They're not a capital necessarily expenditure. Your utilities, your advertising contracts, and your delivery charges, you would think don't, and that is the right answer, Allison, is the delivery charges. But in this case, it actually depends. And the reason that I put this in here is because I wanted to talk about contracts. At the end of the day, a delivery cost is not a typical standing charge, especially if it's a one-time cost and it doesn't continue. But word of caution, we always need to check under the contract. One way to make sure the expense continues is to check the insured's contract or the business's contract with the customers and their suppliers. At the end of the day, you may think that the expense is not going to continue, but there may be a contract that says otherwise. Also, there could be fees associated with that contract that you end up having to pay as a business if you cancel it, if you cancel the delivery charges going forward. So, okay. Do you guys have any questions so far? I'm not trying to go through this stuff too fast, but it is insurance, so I will not take offense if it is a little dry sometimes either. So,
No, I think we're good so far.
you good so far?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So when we're talking about business income interruption and the different forms for the different types of businesses, there's a lot of terminology in our industry. I'm going to talk about two of them right now. There is a third that I'm going to mention, but the two main ones that you want to be aware of are the profits and gross earnings. And the next slide, I'm going to get into the difference in these and why they're so important. How we explain the difference is really about the indemnity period. The profits form, which we call the back to normal indemnity period. The idea is that the coverage under this form continues until your profits return to normal. Okay. On the other hand, you got the gross earnings form that we call or refer to as maybe the doors open indemnity period, which is typically until the business opens again, plus a specified number of days, which is usually 30 days. Many times in the industry, we can see more than 30 days, but 30 days seems to be the norm. We recommend, and any broker probably will, the profits form, just because it has a better indemnity period. Now I got a slide after this to kind of show that. The gross earnings form means as soon as your building's built, you're up and running again, coverage stops. It doesn't look at whether your profits have returned to normal, which can sometimes take months. In the case where you're back to business, your customers have gone and found another vendor, it may take a while to get them back. So super important to look at the timeline, and I'll bring it up right here. So you have your loss that occurs, and let's say your building burns down and they rebuild it in 6 months and your coverage stops. They may give you an extra 30 days. Sometimes I see 60 days on policies, but then you're not going to get any more expenses. But your sales, the problem with this form, and a lot of people have this and don't even realize it, the problem is that your sales are 50% after your building's built. Your fixed costs haven't went down. Your variable costs may be a little bit lower, but your profitability is, just because you haven't scaled your revenue back to where it was originally, your profitability is still at an ultra, the lowest point you've seen in years. And you just went through 6 months where you were dealing with all these headaches of trying to get your business back up and running. The profits form, your building's built in 6 months, but they look at what your revenue is, and for the next 12 months or whatever the indemnity period is, you're still going to get that additional money coming back in to cover those expenses until the 12 months is finished. So you get that extra leadway to go back, get your customers back in the door, and that may be an extra expense that is a part of the business income interruption form that allows you to do that, to maybe produce more marketing materials to bring more customers back to your business. Super important to realize the indemnity period and the different type of business income interruption and how it affects that indemnity period. So if you guys do have questions on that, you can ask me after, or ask your broker. Take a look at your own insurance policy and see what you have, whether it's a gross profits form or a profits form. You may have something called an ALS form, or an actual loss sustained form, that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. That's a kind of based off of a comprehensive profits type form, but it's a little bit better, eliminates things like coinsurance. So jump over. So just kind of an overview of what we have here. The forms, we've already talked about the gross earnings and the profits, but just a quick few points on each one. Gross earnings form, when it comes to calculating the sum that we're insured for, refer to this as kind of the top-down approach. And it's short for total sales less non-standing charges. The indemnity period is what we refer to as the doors open. It's typically 12 months, but it can be increased. And I recommend that you increase your indemnity form to at least 24 months, if not 36, if that's possible. It's not for all types of businesses, but if you can, most buildings don't get rebuilt within 12 months. So with the profits, the sum insured is calculated with a bottoms-up equation, which is essentially the net profit plus the standing charge. So again, the indemnity period back to normal. When the profits are back to what they were before the loss, then indemnity period is typically 12 months. Again, if you have a larger indemnity period or longer indemnity period, that's better. Then there's the extra expense, and this is necessary for expenses to continue the conduct of the insured's business, help mitigate the loss. So let's say get those revenues back up, you have additional marketing fees to bring those customers back in. Let's say there's additional costs for getting a specialized piece of machining equipment in, and it's only built out of Germany. The wait time's 14 months. Well, it might cost an extra $80,000 to get that over here in 6 months so that your business can start operating again. So super important if you have any kind of specialized equipment in the building that you're operating in, or that's part of your business. Maybe you're a shop that needs a certain type of crane or something in your shop to be able to lift certain sizes of equipment to do work on, and you know it's a 10-ton crane and you can't get one right away. So maybe they rent one or they bring one in, because that's going to increase your revenue and get you going right away. Any kind of specialized equipment, you want to look at what your extra expense is going to be. So the big thing about extra expense is that typically use up 100% of the value within the first month of your loss. So if you're going to increase any kind of value on your extra expense form, it's probably worth it. Definitely something to look into a little bit closer. Then the newest form, which I mentioned earlier, is your actual loss sustained. The beauty of this form is that there's no assigned limit. So you don't need to worry about what your profits or your revenue are. The insured gets to prove there's a loss and prove the amount of the loss. This is a back to normal form, so same as your profits form. Word of caution though, seeing many different actual loss sustained forms and wordings in the marketplace. So look really closely at them to learn how the indemnity period and the limit of insurance works. My thoughts are the actual loss sustained form is really designed for small to medium-sized businesses. It's much more of a customer-centric approach to the business interruption. It makes determining the limits of insurance easier because there's no specific limit of insurance assigned. It's also great for growing businesses that are expecting to grow, or experiencing large changes in either their total revenues or their net income. When you do the profits or gross earnings form, typically you get a worksheet from the insurance company, and that worksheet helps you determine what value you should have. If your revenues are $2 or $3 million, you're probably going to request one. And a lot of the time, insureds have a difficulty completing those with the accuracy that the insurance companies want. So you got to send them to your accountant. So it's a little bit of work to get the right, limits in place from the insurance company perspective. The ALS form completely eliminates that, makes it really, really easy to use. Okay, so this question is just going to kind of be allow me to emphasize a little bit on the extra expense coverage, because one thing that you don't want to do as an insurance broker or somebody in our industry, you want to make sure the company has adequate coverage, but you also don't want people to pay for stuff that they don't need. So when I'm looking at these, which of the best represents an example of a business that may only purchase extra expense forms, so they're not getting the gross profits, they're not getting, the actual loss sustained, they're just buying extra expense. I seen Carolyn typing there, but looked like she stopped.
I'm going to say manufacturing.
Okay, so on the manufacturing, you're definitely going to want the extra expense form, but you're also going to want the business income interruption coverage on top of that, right? So the extra expense form here is perfect for just a small business with computers and phones. The reason being is they can just get up, they can operate from wherever they want to be. They need a desk, a computer, a cell phone maybe, and away they go. They can take their operation, go someplace else. So maybe say a web designer or somebody in marketing, somebody that doesn't really need the physical location for where they are to respond to this. But this is where we go back to, they might not need flood coverage either. But if they are in High River when it flooded, they wouldn't activate the extra expense coverage under the policy without the flood coverage being an insured peril. So, but I mean, if it's $100,000 and they have to relocate, if you had to relocate and go and rent a space to operate out of Whitecourt for 3 or 4 months, then this extra expense is going to cover your lease payment. It's going to cover maybe additional traveling costs going back and forth. There's, you might need your internet needs to get hooked up. There's a whole bunch of little expenses that are going to follow that. When business is down, those extra expenses are just going to cripple you as a business owner, especially a small business owner, right? Especially if all your business is in the community that's being affected by the fire or the flood or the catastrophic loss. If you're a larger business and you got offices in Slave Lake, Whitecourt, Edson, Fox Creek, Grand Prairie, Peace River, and Fox Creek is shut down, not the end of the world. Your other 6 offices or shops or retail locations are still operating. But if you're just a small business and Fox Creek is the only place you do business, super important to have that in place. So,
Trevor, I just see a quick question here. Can you touch on if any of these forms include payroll for employees out of work while the business is down?
Absolutely. So I've kind of talked about the actual form itself for the insurance. So your gross earnings, your profits, your actual loss sustained. Inside these coverages, you're going to have sub coverages underneath. So a few of these right here. So ordinary payroll. This is what we're kind of talking about. This is maybe one of the bigger ones, I think. Covers the salaries of all employees for the full indemnity period. Many other forms are only going to cover salaries of executives or salaries for a limited time period. Coverage is important for various reasons, including community goodwill. There was a loss in our industry a few years ago that this really affected. It was in a small farming community. I'm not going to go into the details because I don't want to talk about the loss. It was in detail, but the operations were shut down, and the employer that had these operations shut down was really the main employer for the small town. The business suffered the loss. It was catastrophic. Operations went down, and it hit the town really hard, and a lot of people suffered from the unemployment because of the loss, not having ordinary payroll on there. So their policy covered the executives, the controllers, the management of the company, but the other 40 people that made their livelihood, and a lot of these families, these 40 families, these were single income families, that those wages weren't covered. The ordinary payroll wasn't covered. So ordinary payroll is a really big thing to put on the policy, and then really dive into your wordings, because it's not like auto where your statutory conditions are legislated. When you get into commercial insurance, you have the Insurance Bureau of Canada that puts out a standard form, And a lot of insurance companies run with a variation of that standard form, but it doesn't mean that that's what their wordings have to cover. So we throw these terms around as, insurance brokers, as actual loss sustained or ordinary payroll. But when you get into the wordings with, say, Juanisa or Intact or Viva, their wordings might all be a little bit different. And it might have limitations on what ordinary payroll means. Whereas you might have a policy with, economical, and the ordinary payroll might cover everybody's payroll, and there is no limitations in there. So really dive into the wordings, but what you are looking for is ordinary payroll if you can get that coverage under your business income interruption. The next one here that I'm going to touch on is the contingent business income. And this is really interesting, especially I think for the town of Fox Creek. So it's often offered as an extension under the business income form, and has standalone wordings on the policy. Basically, it's business income interruption resulting from loss or damage by an insured peril on a contingent property. So this is where a trucking company may find coverage under the business income interruption. The interesting word here is contingent, because we do not mean damage to the insured's property. What we're talking about is someone else's property. So it could be a contributing property, for example, a supplier of goods or services to that business. It could be a recipient property. So that would be the customer of the insured's goods or services. Okay, so let's say a gas plant burnt down, and that's where you did all your work and your servicing, and it didn't affect any of your property, but that was your major customer. Maybe you're an electrical and instrumentation company in the oil and gas industry, and you had 5 different gas plants that you had, electricians on 24 hours a day. You supplied all the material and parts to those gas plants, and that was, your warehouse that stored all the material and parts weren't down. It didn't burn down. There's no physical loss to you, but now you're not going to work because 2 of those gas plants burnt down. What kind of revenue do you think that those 2 gas plants generated for that electrical and instrumentation company? So, or it could be a leader store. Another word I've heard, an anchor store. You guys have probably heard of in the retail kind of context. It would be a store nearby that drives traffic to the customer. So a few examples of each. With the contributing property, insured only has one supplier. They get all the raw materials to manufacture their goods from this one supplier. That supplier suffers a loss and can't provide the raw material, and therefore the insured cannot build their product. So the insured thus suffers a business income interruption loss. No physical damage to their own property, but their supplier had a loss, and it's from an insured peril on your policy. So again, make sure that you have the flood coverage, the fire coverage, the earthquake coverage. Even if you don't think that earthquakes are going to affect you here, what if your supplies comes from Vancouver or southern BC and they have an earthquake? So the earthquake coverage costs you $125. And I have clients all the time that say, I don't want it. There's never going to be an earthquake here. I'm not paying the extra $125 on a $6,000, $8,000 commercial liability and property policy. Take the earthquake coverage. It's one of those things that is going to kind of come back to bite you if you don't. The recipient property, I kind of gave you the example of the gas plants, but it's kind of the other way around from contributing properties. So let's say your insured has one major customer who suffers a loss and no longer needs their products from the insured business. The insured is going to have a business interruption loss as their main customer is no longer purchasing from them. Okay. This could be just, I know there's a lot of logging in the Whitecourt area. What if one of those plants goes down? Now, from our perspective, fire is the main hazard at all those plants. Because when those plants go down, fire, it lights up really quick. So make sure that if you're working for one of those plants, that you're spending the money getting the contingent business income interruption coverage. Because who are you going to haul logs for all of a sudden if you're a logging company? You really don't have a lot of property besides your equipment and your auto, which may not be covered under the business income interruption. But insure your small shop and your office. Talk to your broker about the contingent coverage, because if that mill goes down, you're in trouble, right? And that's your only customer. Maybe that's who you do 80, 90% of your work for. So could definitely affect you. Lastly, we talked about a leader store. Um, we've all seen this in locations in neighborhoods or small towns. So maybe a local mall or a big strip mall. You have a Walmart or a Sobeys next to the store, or maybe your main grocery store in the town. And then you got a shoemaker, or say maybe a flower shop or something. These smaller businesses rely on the traffic that goes to the Walmart or the Sobeys. If something happens to that Walmart or Sobeys and it shuts down, traffic is going to be eliminated almost completely. This causes the shoemaker or the, whatever other businesses are, a flower shop, to suffer the business loss, and contingent business coverage would kick in. So those are three things that a lot of people say, well, I don't really need the business income interruption coverage, but you're not going to get, there's some companies that will offer a standalone coverage for that, but typically it's a form that follows the business income interruption, and that contingent coverage can be super, super important. Okay, so the one big thing there though, coverage, the contingent business is one of the only coverages where you're looking at the peril on your policy, but the property damage is to somebody else's policy. So you still need that insured peril, being like a fire, flood, sewer backup, earthquake. You still need that covered on your own policy, okay? So the next one we'll kind of get into here is the blanket business income. So lastly, it's just a blanket business income with a blanket limit of insurance for all locations. So really important when you have an insured or a business maybe with several locations, stock going back and forth from those locations. A good example of this would be something like Northern Metallic or Greg's Distributors, where you maybe have a warehouse and a retail facility. So if you can get the blanket coverage, take a look at it for sure, because what you'll do is you'll get one big blanket coverage to the fact that you're going to have maybe Peace River, White Court, and Grand Prairie shut down. With if you're Northern Metallic, not likely. So a blanket coverage is something that may be very appropriate for that type of business. I don't see it too much on small businesses that only have one location, but if you can get it, sometimes it's worth looking at. Any questions on those things, you guys? Usually when I talk about the contingent coverage, that's where I get a few of the questions. One, Carolyn already asked a question on the payroll. Any other questions on the contingent business interruption coverage?
I was just thinking, is there, so pre or post catastrophe, let's say, is there, what's the likelihood of somebody actually being able to access that insurance post catastrophe? Is it, I know you had mentioned even in our chats, Trevor, that sometimes you can't even get the insurance, like if there's a fire burning X amount of kilometers away from you.
Okay. So one of the things I'm going to bring up and talk to you guys about, so this is as good a time as any. We're in Grand Prairie right now, or I am at least. We have a fire burning. If any of you guys are familiar with the area, there's a little town called, not even a town, maybe a hamlet called Valhalla. It's in between Hythe and La Glace. There's a lot of oil and gas and farming activity in that area. There's a fire to the north of there, kind of into the Saddle Hills. There's also one just when you come across the Smoky River, coming into Bezanson, go north, and you're up right along the river. So those fires, the one in Teepee Creek is about 35 kilometers, 36 kilometers from Grand Prairie. Insurance companies will have limitations on binding authority. So if there is an out of control fire, most insurance companies are about 50 kilometers. Intact is 25. Some companies will look at it and say, you know what, you can bind coverage in Grand Prairie because there's a small fire that still shows on the map, but it just shows on the map, but it doesn't show as out of control. Whereas Pembridge says, no, it's on the map. It's within, say, 100 kilometers. You can't bind any coverage. By binding coverage, I mean adding property to a new building, a course of construction. So maybe you're starting construction on a new shop. These will all be things that the lender or anybody that's financing is going to require to have in place. They'll be mandatory. If you're buying a house, if you want to buy a vehicle and it's financed and you need physical coverage on it, a lot of companies will say 50 kilometers, there's a fire within your address. You're not going to be able to get coverage on it. So now how are you going to, they're not going to give you the vehicle. So if you're looking at doing these things, start the process of getting insurance in place sooner than later. And then you have it quoted, you know what the premium's going to be, you know that the coverage is going to be able to be placed with this market so that you can place it as soon as you need it. But as soon as a fire starts, lots of the time it's 50 kilometers, Christy, and insurance companies say we're not binding anything. Intact does allow us 25 kilometers in Grand Prairie. They realize it's very unlikely that the fire is going to spread from TP Creek through Cluskin Lake, an old lake that was drained where there's no trees and with no crops in them right now for 35 kilometers. And we always get west winds. But a lot of other insurance companies, I mean, you make the decision like Lloyd's of London will just say, no, maybe it's 100 kilometers. And it's somebody in London that's making the decision. And we don't really get a choice in the matter. It's, no, we can't. So maybe you got to go to a specialty market, but your premium is, instead of $6,000 for insuring a building, they want $14,000. That's a lot of money for any business, right? And you're stuck with it. The other thing that I want you guys to be aware of is when you can talk to your lawyer about this. I don't want to give legal advice, but my understanding, and I think this is probably correct, is you put a condition of financing when you buy a property, and then you get the money released in trust, and the insurance or the lawyer's office won't release that money from trust until they have a binder, which is confirmation of fire insurance. I always thought that condition of financing included the insurance policy. I've been told that it doesn't. So the bank releases the money, the condition of financing has been met, but you can't get insurance in place, so the lawyers won't release the money. And now you've met all your conditions. So we had a client actually up here in Grand Prairie that purchased a home, or wanted to put an offer on a home conditional to a sale in Grand Prairie down in Vancouver. And the person couldn't get insurance on the property because of the fires here last year. The sale didn't go through. He couldn't purchase his home in Grand Prairie. All the conditions were met. And by the time 3 months later, he was able to get his home sold now and purchase the one in Vancouver. The property was $100,000 more in value. So who pays that $100,000? The person that put the offer in met all the conditions, but then couldn't get the money released because they couldn't get insurance. So those are the type of things that you can run into. But 50 kilometers, pretty much a good ballpark there for distance from a fire.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, so some of the challenges that we run into is selecting the right indemnity period. We often see challenges with it, and then what the actual limit is. It's not quite as easy as it sounds. Overall, business income has and will continue to be kind of a challenge for us. It's an intangible thing that we try to put on policies. It's linked to a property coverage, but there's no tangible loss. And sometimes these losses and coverages for protecting against them seem difficult to explain. So I do appreciate you guys coming today and listening to some of this stuff. Recommendations, if possible, we want you to go with an actual loss sustained policy. It's going to help you avoid the business income worksheets that can get a little bit overly complicated. Critically analyze for worst case scenarios and how long it'll take to get back to normal. And then think about the mitigation plans that can be implemented and put back in place. So question, company has this is something I want to talk on real quick, and it's the cyber stuff, because in this case, a company has their data scrambled and hacked and cannot access their files. It takes 4 business days to get back up and running. During these 4 days, they cannot take any clients. Is this business coverage interruption loss? And yeah, really trying to trick you. Typically, it's not. But first, the business has to have cyber coverage. And then if they do have cyber coverage, it has to include business income interruption separately under the cyber policy. So don't get that mixed up when you're looking at your policy. You'll have regular business income interruption coverage, but unless there's some that falls under the cyber side of the policy, you're not going to have coverage for that. This is becoming a major thing. And the reason I bring it up is because when catastrophic events happen, this is prime territory for people to go in and start trying to hack into people's networks and get onto their servers, send phishing schemes and get in there. People are in a kind of a disarray. They're sending emails from phones and text messages, and they're just trying to get anything done they can get done as fast as possible and put out fires. And, you know, they take advantage of these scenarios. So, okay. So on cyber events, we're looking at property policies. Number one here, back to this. Most insurers do offer cyber policy bundles or customer policies that custom policies that include business income coverage for specific limits. These cyber coverages for business interruption include is usually included under the cyber policy, but every insurer is a little bit different in what they offer. It's usually a sub limit for the business income interruption. This is because there's a downtime that's typically less than your business income interruption due to a property loss. So typically full policy limits aren't required. To summarize the key point, if there's a cyber loss causing business interruption, the business will require that cyber policy with business interruption included on there. And if you don't have a cyber policy and you're a small business, definitely look into it. You can get policies in that range of maybe $100,000 worth of coverage for a pretty reasonable premium. These days, they're not cheap, but they're definitely worth it if things get hacked or you suffer a social engineering claim or something like that. So.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I mean we're seeing that more and more and more.
It's by far the most uninsured loss in Canada and the US. It is, and the technology is getting up there. The computing power that they can use to get into things is just extraordinary. So, you know, things like multi-factor authentication, which is becoming pretty common, great to install for your business. That kind of software is fairly affordable. Those things are nice to have in place. Using a cloud where if your data is compromised, you can access the cloud and it's backed up every day at the end of the day, or maybe multiple times throughout the day. And, you know, if your cloud's in Vancouver and Toronto, if there's a loss in Toronto that takes down the servers, you still have your data in Vancouver. To make sure you're looking at your privacy restrictions and where that data is being stored. So, but yeah, definitely something to be aware of. So, the other thing is the business continuity. When we're looking at this, number one, to prepare effectively for the business interruption is just kind of selecting the right limit, right period of indemnity. To do this well and to plan the risk management side of a business, have a clear understanding what could happen, what the worst case scenario is, and how to address it. Although losses do happen, and you want the right coverage, it's best, everyone's best interest to get everybody back up and running as soon as possible. So talk to your broker. Lots of brokers will have tools in place to help plan with this, depending on the type of business you are with the insurance companies. Some insurance companies even have risk management groups that'll go out to certain businesses, and they'll help you assist in doing this. The business recovery plan. So here we're talking about three main components of the recovery plan. Keep in mind, these plans are all going to vary depending on the size of business, type of business, etc. What I want to talk about here is just not large businesses that need the plans in place. And it's just not about disasters either. I hear a lot about disaster planning, but I think it's more than that. Although we've all seen an increase in the frequency of the catastrophic losses in the recent years, it doesn't take away from the need to prepare for this stuff for smaller events. Essentially planning to be ready for anything. It could be an interruption of a week or two, but a business needs to be able to determine what their steps are going forward in the event of a loss. So building that emergency response plan, building a plan to resume your operations, and the continuity plan going forward. So, and then just make sure as a small business, you anticipate the loss from financial, operational, or marketing perspectives, regardless of the size of your business. Be able to identify the risks, plan for them, and then communicate them. Communication involves many facets, in my opinion. So communication of the plan to everyone is aligned, and also communicate it to stakeholders in the event of a loss. So understanding what a business makes a business tick is kind of a good starting point. But you know, your suppliers, your employees, the people that you're not just the suppliers that are supplying you, but the people you're supplying your services to, giving them an idea of what you're going to do in the event of a disaster or a shutdown of your business, how you're going to do that, to show them that you're planning something on an ongoing basis and that you've already, looked into these things. Super important. It might seem like a lot of work, but I think once you start looking at the different ways that you can handle things, the different plans you can put in place and procedures, it's not such an overwhelming process. And I think when you approach your customers and they know that you have a plan in place, if they're not already asking for you to do that, they'll be impressed. I mean, it'll look good on the business to show them that you've taken the time to do that.
And probably not only customers, but even employees as well. That could be a strategy around employee retention.
Yeah, we had a company that actually operated out of Fox Creek, and we said, is it possible to have, an idea of how you're going to operate in, say, Edson, Whitecourt, and Valley View if a loss happens in Fox Creek, so you can still service a lot of the industry that you're working in from other areas, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and then the last one, this is something that I'll go through with a lot of my clients, is just kind of a hazard assessment, looking at the different things that they feel that can go wrong. This gives us a perspective from our industry to be able to turn around and identify maybe where they feel there's an area where they're going to be more at risk than not. So a lot of insurance companies or risk management companies will have a hazard assessment that you can go through. This is kind of not by any means a way that you should do it, but it is a way of just going through and starting the conversation. And that is it for my presentation. But overall, when you're dealing with your broker from an insurance standpoint, you're looking at the catastrophic losses that could affect you, the different kinds of coverages that, from an insurance perspective, are going to be able to provide some kind of relief. Make sure that they're working with you to help mitigate the losses and come up with a game plan, not just give you the coverage and walk away. Like, they need to understand your business enough to know, because if they don't understand your business, it's going to be hard for them to put the right coverage in place on that policy for your business. So any questions?
You can also pop some questions in the chat if you like.
I see we had lost a couple of people, but we're right at 12:30. So
Yeah. And what we could do too is, if anybody does have any questions that they think of post this presentation, feel free to forward them on to me, and I can definitely connect you in with Trevor and get those questions answered. But definitely this was very interesting presentation, Trevor, and it's it what I've learned even over the past year, it's not a question of if it's going to happen, it's when it's going to happen, and that being prepared is like, it's so important. So I really appreciate you taking the time today to share this information with us, and definitely we'll be in touch if there's any additional questions. And thank you to everyone who was able to join in today as well. I hope this gave you some additional information that you're able to take back and consider, and potentially, prepare for future events. So
yeah. And thank you guys all for your patience. This was my first presentation that I did virtually, so I'm
working off of two devices. You got her figured out.
Yeah, I'm not. I'm more of an in-person person. I prefer to do things. There's a room of 30 people and present it. It's easy to get interaction from people and to see where the room's going as you do the presentation. So this is a little bit different, but I enjoyed it. And I know insurance can be awfully, awfully dry and boring. So hopefully this wasn't too bad. And you guys maybe started some questions for your guys, just spur the conversation a little bit. Um, there is a lot that business income interruption coverage can do for a business if there's a loss or a catastrophic event. So yeah,
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again, Trevor.
thank you guys.
Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
You too. Take
Bye-bye.
care.